Today, we're looking back to the beginning of a chapter in history. This chapter right here that we're living through at the moment. Why? Because I think this chapter is about to end, and with it, everything about our way of life. And I want to explore what comes next. And you know what? Where we're going? I think we may have been there before. When we look back from today at the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s, we feel a sense of connection to this period in history and the people who lived in those times.
Nostalgia. It's delicate, but potent.
Even though we may not have lived during that period in time, we have a sense of what life was like. On a superficial level, the celebrities, the fashion, the music, but also on a deeper level, we understand the mood and what life might have felt like. We can do this because we have this sense of continuity between the world that we live in today and the world that they lived in back then. But when we go back too far in history, this continuity is broken. We don't feel that sense of connection. We don't understand what it might have felt like to live during those times. And this isn't because these times have just faded from living memory, or because we don't have contemporary media set during these times. It's that life was fundamentally different. Different institutions, values, cultural expectations, a different social contract. Life is cyclical, and every so often this continuity is broken. We pass from one chapter in history, we complete a cycle and pass into the next, and everything about society, our day-to-day life, changes irreversibly. Humanity goes through some fundamental transition from the old world to the new. But although everything has changed, we have, in some sense, been here before, because history is cyclical.
It's not called the wheel. It's called the carousel.
The carousel of history completes a full rotation and begins again. Everything feels different, but if you know where to look, you'll see the similarities. What if I told you that just as the world has changed irreversibly before, passed from one chapter of history to another, completed a full cycle, and begun another, and with it everything changed? What if I told you that that was about to happen again? And that in some sense we have been here before? What if I told you that within our lifetimes, in fact no, within the next decade, that we were going to turn the page on this chapter of history and begin another? Life is cyclical. As humans, we have a natural inclination to understand life in terms of cycles. In Buddhism and Hinduism, all life goes through birth, life, death, and rebirth, known as the cycle of samsara. Humans have always lived at the mercy of the seasons, which come and go year after year with dependable regularity. But recently, certain longer term and more social or societal cycles have begun to gain attention.
Employed by riot police. East Precinct riot police moving in with the stealth of ninjas.
In looking at the increasingly uncertain world that we see around us, people are beginning to ask, have we been here before? Is there anything we can learn from history that might tell us about the future? Understanding these kinds of things, understanding how the world is changing around us and what might happen and how the world might change over the next decade or so and throughout our lives, is crucial to living a prosperous life, whether it comes to assessing opportunities within your career, business opportunities or investment, other material things like that, things like family planning, and to be honest, even your own mental well-being. Understanding what is actually happening in the world and what is actually driving change can just give you a grounding in reality that's going to allow you to make better decisions and just feel better about the world, as opposed to having some narrative spoon-fed to you. On this channel, we attempt to understand the changing world. And today, in this video, we're going to examine the idea that we're coming to the end of a long cycle in history, We're going to look at a specific theory of history, a specific framework, and try to use it to understand where we might go over the next few years. Now, this is the first video within a series in which we're going to look at a few different kind of cyclical theories of history that suggest where we might be going over the next few years. So, if that sounds like something you might be interested in, hit like on this video and consider subscribing to the channel. Either way, enjoy. In their book, The Fourth Turning, Neil Howe and William Strauss describe this generational theory of history, this recurring generational cycle of societal prosperity, growth, decay, crisis, and rebirth. And recently, this theory, this framework, is beginning to gain increased attention, because written and published in about 1997, a lot of its predictions have actually come to pass, and we're actually kind of living through a period that the authors predicted that we would live through around 25 years ago. Now, the cycle that they describe lasts around 80 to 100 years, or the length of a long human life. And the long cycle is split into 4 what they call turnings. Now, each turning has a very different quality to it. Living through each of these periods from one to the next is very different. The lived experience of living within that period, within that turning, is very different. And these are cycles that repeat themselves throughout history. So let's talk about this cyclical theory of history. Let's talk about each of these 4 turnings and what the character and quality of life is like within each one. Then let's place ourselves within the framework, within the long cycle. Talk about where we are within it and where the authors think we are within it. And then let's discuss where that means we might go over the next few years. So according to the authors, the current long cycle began with the first turning in the wake of World War II in 1945. The first turning is a high, which begins after a crisis. It's a time of real collectivism and conformity and social consensus. Society has just come through something traumatic and feels a strong sense of where it wants to go. It's a time of conformity. Now, if you think about what life seems to have been like during this time, the idea that this was a time of conformity really kind of resonates, doesn't it? You know, it's the era of the white picket fence and, prescribed identity, real kind of a strong sense of social roles and what it meant to be a husband, a wife, an American, the husband, the worker, the wife, the homemaker, even a child, and what was kind of expected in terms of things like patriotism. Within our current cycle, this first turning began after the crisis that was World War II in 1945. And that period of kind of conformity and collectivism, that high, societal high, lasted until 1963 with the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. The second turning is an awakening, an era when people become tired of institutions and social conformity and begin to prioritise things like spirituality, self-discovery. So apparently within our current cycle, this era was defined by the consciousness revolution, hippies and the sweeping social reforms of the mid to late 60s, and lasted until the early 80s.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
The third turning is an unraveling, a time when institutions are weak and individualism is on the rise, and that kind of collectivism, which underpinned the institutional legitimacy that defined the first turning, is beginning to wane. That collectivism has given way to individualism, and social norms and values and behaviours which kind of uphold the system begin to be attacked because people don't buy into the system anymore. When I read this book for the first time, it made me think of all of those films from the mid-1990s. Fight Club, The Matrix, Trainspotting, which explored themes around young people rejecting the established structure that had been built for them. And for me, the kind of cultural impact of those films and their continued cultural relevance really kind of provides validation for this fourth turning framework. Clearly, these things that are being described within the fourth turning, the book, were being felt very widely within society at that time. Now onto the fourth turning and the period in time that we are currently in. Fourth turnings are a time of crisis, an era of destruction in which institutional life is destroyed and rebuilt in response to a perceived threat. We've seen this happen before, and it looks like we're going through it again. Now, in the year 1997 or 6, when this book was published, the authors suggested that we would arrive at such a period of crisis around the year 2020, in the early to mid 2020s. And they were right. If you look around the world today, it's clear that what's going on is a rejection of institutional authority. And unfortunately, with that, things can start to feel quite dark, hopeless, and you kind of sense the institutional decay, and you can't really see a way forward or see how we get back on track. If we stick with the film theme, we can wonder why a character like the Joker is finding so much resonance and feels so relevant today. A man whose whole shtick is succumbing to the temptation to despair. But team, we mustn't despair, because understanding the fourth turning and understanding history in this cyclical way leads us to kind of see that in terms of what's coming next over the next few years, yes, we might be entering a period of sustained kind of crisis, but once we move through that and we come out the other side, we will enter a period of increasing hope. We're heading into some tough times, but we've been here before, and we will come through the other side. Now together, these four turnings make up the long cycle, and it's important to note the point with this kind of framework isn't to suggest what the exact path forward will be. It's just to suggest that what we're living through, and I guess contextualize what we're living through, and to suggest that this isn't just some period of temporary unrest that will kind of pass once we elect the right person. It's a fundamental shift for society. It's about us completing one cycle of history and moving into another. It's a period of decay before a period of rebirth. And when we pass through the other side, nothing will be the same. Now, the whole point of this video and the value I wanted it to provide to you, the viewer, is to understand that massive change is afoot. This disruption, uncertainty that we see when we look out at the world isn't going to resolve itself in a way that means that things will go back to normal. Now is the time to entertain big ideas, whether it's about the nature of work and your career, investments, and hearing out people's kind of investment theses and the way that they might clash with the kind of established frameworks and models that have persisted for a long time previously, whether it's the way you think about the life you want for your family. Whatever it is, now is the time to entertain those big ideas. Now is the time to understand that huge change is afoot and to move with change when it comes to things that perhaps you like, but also to fight against things you don't. And it's super important to understand this stuff so that you don't go the way of the Joker. Yes, we might be going through tough times. Yes, things might look uncertain. Yes, everything might be kind of facing significant disruption. But it will pass, we will move through it, and once we come out of the other side, things will look more hopeful. So many people today are succumbing to the despair that comes with watching the established order of things decay and enter a period of crisis and get steadily worse. But understand that it's always darkest before the dawn, and if the authors are right, then once we pass through this period of disruption and crisis, we'll enter a period of increasing prosperity. So today we've spoken about one cyclical theory of history that suggests that we're coming to the end of a long cycle and that lots of things are about to change. On our next video, we're going to be exploring a completely different theory of history, which to be honest suggests pretty much exactly the same thing. Specifically, it's Ray Dalio's idea of the long-term debt cycle. And I find it so interesting that these two theories of history, the fourth turning and the long-term debt cycle, marry up perfectly in their timing and suggest that we're coming to the end of a period, a chapter in history, and about to enter a new one. Big change is coming, and this channel is where we try to understand it. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.